The blood on the marble floor wasn't supposed to be there. Rebecca Matthews Caldwell pressed her trembling hand against the cold stone of the Caldwell Industries lobby, her 7-month pregnant belly straining against her designer maternity dress as waves of pain crashed through her body like breaking glass. She had come here with dinner reservations at Harrison's favorite restaurant and news that would change everything. Their baby was a girl, their daughter, the child they had hoped for during 3 years of marriage that had grown increasingly cold and distant. Instead, she found herself staring through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of Harrison's executive office, watching her husband of 3 years cup the face of Vivian Sterling, his 26-year-old marketing director, as they kissed with the desperate passion he hadn't shown Rebecca in over a year. The shock hit her nervous system like ice water, and her body responded with a sharp contraction that doubled her over and sent her designer handbag scattering across the pristine marble. "No, no, no," she whispered through gritted teeth, clutching her swollen belly as another wave of pain crashed through her. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when she finally had something beautiful and hopeful to share with the man she had loved since college. The man who had promised her forever during a fairy tale wedding that had cost more than most people's houses. The cramping intensified, and Rebecca felt a warm wetness between her legs that terrified her more than the betrayal she had just witnessed. Something was wrong. Something was seriously wrong with the baby, with her precious daughter who had been kicking so vigorously just an hour ago during her doctor's appointment. The executive office door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and Vivian Sterling emerged first, her perfectly applied red lipstick somehow intact despite the passionate embrace Rebecca had witnessed. She was everything Rebecca felt she wasn't anymore. Tall, slim, despite never having carried a child, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Rebecca's monthly allowance, and radiating the kind of predatory confidence that came from knowing she was desired. When Vivian's cold blue eyes found Rebecca crumpled on the floor, her expression shifted from mild surprise to something uglier, something that revealed the calculating nature beneath her polished exterior. "Well, well," Vivian said, her voice dripping with false concern that fooled no one within hearing distance. "Look what the cat dragged in. You pathetic cow. Can't you see he doesn't want you anymore? Look at yourself. Fat, sweaty, desperate. Is this really how you thought you'd win him back?" Rebecca struggled to stand, her legs shaking from both physical pain and emotional devastation. Her maternity dress, which had made her feel beautiful and radiant during her doctor's appointment, now felt like a tent that advertised her vulnerability. "Vivian, I just came to surprise Harrison with dinner. I wasn't trying to—" "Save it," Vivian interrupted with a harsh laugh that echoed through the marble lobby. "We all know what this is. Another desperate attempt to get attention because you can't handle the fact that Harrison has outgrown you. He's a powerful man with sophisticated needs, and you're just a boring little housewife who got knocked up to trap him." Another contraction hit Rebecca so hard that she gasped and grabbed the nearest wall for support. The pain was different now, sharper and more urgent, accompanied by a growing sense that something fundamental was going wrong with her pregnancy. Harrison appeared in the doorway, his 6-foot frame filling the space as his dark eyes found his pregnant wife struggling on the lobby floor. His face went white with what appeared to be genuine panic, and for a moment Rebecca saw a flash of the man she had fallen in love with. The man who had held her during her father's funeral, who had surprised her with breakfast in bed on random Tuesday mornings, who had cried when they saw their baby's first ultrasound. "Rebecca, what are you doing here? Are you okay? Oh God, are you hurt?" The questions tumbled out of him as he rushed toward her, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble in a rhythm that matched Rebecca's racing heartbeat. The genuine panic in his voice might have comforted her once, back when she believed that his concern for her was automatic and unconditional. Now it only highlighted how long it had been since he had shown her that kind of immediate, instinctive worry about her well-being. "I wanted to surprise you," Rebecca managed between contractions, her voice barely above a whisper. "The doctor's appointment, the ultrasound. Harrison, she's a girl. Our baby is a girl. We're having a daughter." For a moment that felt suspended in time, Harrison's face transformed with pure joy. His eyes lit up with the kind of happiness Rebecca hadn't seen from him in months. and he stepped toward her with his arms outstretched as if to embrace both her and the news of their daughter. Then he seemed to remember Vivian's presence behind him, and the light dimmed like a candle being slowly extinguished. His arms fell to his sides, and he glanced back at his mistress with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite read. Guilt, uncertainty, or maybe just the calculated consideration of a businessman weighing his options. "Call 911," Harrison shouted to Frank, the elderly security guard who had worked in the building for 15 years and had always greeted Rebecca with genuine warmth during her visits. But before Frank could reach for his radio, Vivian moved with surprising speed to intercept Harrison's phone as he pulled it from his jacket pocket. "Harrison, don't be ridiculous," Vivian said smoothly, her manicured fingers wrapping around his phone with possessive confidence. "She's clearly faking this whole thing for attention. Don't let her manipulate you with fake medical drama just because she saw us together. This is exactly the kind of pathetic behavior I warned you about." Rebecca felt another contraction, stronger and more painful than any of the others, accompanied by a sensation that made her heart race with genuine terror. "I'm not faking anything," she gasped, pressing both hands against her belly as if she could somehow protect her daughter from whatever was happening inside her body. "Something's wrong with the baby. Something's really wrong." Frank, who had witnessed enough domestic drama in his years as a security guard to recognize real medical distress, pulled out his personal cell phone despite Vivian's protests. "I'm calling the paramedics, Mrs. Caldwell. You just focus on breathing, okay? Help is coming." As they waited for the ambulance, Rebecca found herself caught between two completely different versions of reality. Harrison knelt beside her on the marble floor, holding her hand and murmuring reassurances about how everything would be fine, how their daughter was strong, how Rebecca was the bravest woman he knew. His touch was gentle and familiar, his voice carrying the same tender tone he had used during their courtship and early marriage. But standing behind him like a malevolent shadow, Vivian continued her psychological assault with the skill of someone who had clearly practiced this kind of manipulation before. She made subtle faces and gestures that suggested Rebecca was overreacting, rolled her eyes at Harrison's concern, and muttered comments just loud enough for Rebecca to hear, but quiet enough that Harrison missed them in his focus on his wife. "This is so typical," Vivian said in a stage whisper that carried perfectly across the marble lobby. "Can't handle that your husband is with a real woman now, so you create a medical emergency to steal the spotlight back. How pathetically predictable." The paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, their professional efficiency a sharp contrast to the emotional chaos that had consumed the lobby. They were a team Rebecca recognized from her days as a pediatric nurse, Maria Santos and David Chen, both veterans of the Metropolitan General Emergency Response Unit, who had seen every kind of medical crisis the city could produce. What do we have here?" Maria asked, immediately taking Rebecca's pulse while David prepared the portable gurney that would transport her to the hospital. "29-year-old female, 31 weeks pregnant," Harrison said, his voice tight with worry. "She's been having contractions and says something feels wrong." Maria nodded professionally while checking Rebecca's blood pressure, her expression growing more concerned as she read the numbers. "Blood pressure is elevated. How long have you been having contractions, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Maybe 20 minutes, Rebecca answered, trying to focus on the paramedics' questions despite the continuing pain. "They started when—" She glanced at Harrison and Vivian, unable to finish the sentence that would reveal the emotional trauma that had triggered her medical crisis. As the paramedics loaded Rebecca onto the stretcher with practiced efficiency, she found herself staring directly into Harrison's eyes for what felt like the first time in months. In that moment, with all the pretense and daily routines stripped away by medical emergency, she asked him the question that would define the rest of their marriage. "Choose," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mechanical sounds of the medical equipment. "Me and your baby, or her. Right now, Harrison. Choose." Harrison hesitated. It was only 3 seconds of silence while his pregnant wife was being loaded into an ambulance. 3 seconds of uncertainty while their unborn daughter's health hung in the balance. 3 seconds of visible internal debate while the woman he had promised to forsake all others for lay on a stretcher in medical distress. But those 3 seconds contained an entire universe of betrayal, and they broke something fundamental in Rebecca's heart that she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. "Harrison?" she said again, her voice stronger now despite her physical pain. I asked you to choose. I, of course I choose you, he finally said. But his voice lacked the immediate conviction she had needed to hear. The words came out like a business decision rather than an emotional declaration, carefully calculated rather than instinctively protective. Vivian, you should go home. I need to handle this situation. But Vivian Sterling had not built her career by backing down when challenged, and she certainly wasn't going to be dismissed by a pregnant woman having what she still believed was a manufactured crisis designed to interfere with her relationship. I'm coming with you to the hospital, she announced with the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. Someone rational needs to be there to make sure she doesn't manipulate the doctors with fake symptoms and imaginary emergencies. The paramedic monitoring Rebecca's vital signs looked up with growing alarm. Ma'am, your blood pressure is dangerously high and continuing to climb. We need to get you to Metropolitan General immediately. The stress you're experiencing could trigger premature labor or other complications. As the ambulance doors slammed shut with a metallic finality that seemed to separate Rebecca from her old life forever, she heard Vivian's voice one last time through the small window. This is all just theatrical attention-seeking, Harrison. Don't let her fool you with crocodile tears and manufactured symptoms. The siren wailed as they sped through the city streets toward Metropolitan General Hospital, but Rebecca barely heard it over the sound of her own heart breaking and her own voice whispering prayers for her daughter's safety. She placed both hands on her belly and made a promise to the child inside her. No matter what happened with Harrison, no matter how this marriage ended, she would make sure her daughter grew up knowing she was wanted, loved, and protected. The ambulance hit a pothole, jarring Rebecca back to the present crisis, and she realized that her old life, the life where she waited for Harrison to choose her, where she competed with other women for her own husband's attention, where she accepted crumbs of affection and called it love, was ending whether she wanted it to or not. Her daughter deserved better than a mother who begged for loyalty that should have been freely given. Metropolitan General Hospital's emergency department buzzed with the controlled chaos that marked the beginning of every evening shift, but the arrival of Rebecca Matthews Caldwell transformed routine into urgency. The paramedics wheeled her through the automatic doors with practiced efficiency while rattling off vital statistics that painted a concerning picture of a pregnancy in crisis. 29-year-old female, 31 weeks pregnant, blood pressure 160 over 110, and climbing steadily, Maria Sanos called out to the receiving team. Patient reports contractions started approximately 30 minutes ago following significant emotional distress. Possible preterm labor, definitely hypertensive crisis. Dr. Elena Martinez, the attending obstetrician who had delivered more than 3,000 babies during her 15-year career at Metropolitan General, took one look at Rebecca's condition and made the kind of rapid-fire decisions that separated experienced physicians from those still learning their craft. Room 3, stat, Dr. Martinez ordered, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of handling obstetric emergencies. I want continuous fetal monitoring, complete blood workup, and someone get me her medical records from her obstetrician. If her blood pressure doesn't start coming down in the next 10 minutes, we're looking at severe preeclampsia. As Rebecca was transferred from the paramedic stretcher to the hospital bed, she felt her daughter moving restlessly inside her, as if the baby could sense the stress and danger that surrounded them both. The fetal monitor was attached with gentle efficiency, and soon the room filled with the rapid but strong heartbeat that provided Rebecca's first moment of relief since this nightmare began. Mrs. Caldwell, Dr. Martinez said, her voice professionally gentle as she checked the readouts from the various monitors now surrounding Rebecca's bed. I need you to try to stay as calm as possible. Your baby's heartbeat is strong and steady, which is excellent news, but your blood pressure is dangerously elevated. Can you tell me what happened this evening to trigger this episode? Before Rebecca could answer, the sound of raised voices echoed from the emergency department waiting room. Harrison's voice, agitated and defensive, mixed with a woman's sharp tones that carried clearly through the supposedly soundproof doors. You need to make sure the doctors understand that she has a history of being overly dramatic about medical issues. Vivian's voice rang out loud enough for multiple nursing stations to hear. She's probably exaggerating her symptoms because she saw Harrison and me together and couldn't handle the reality that he's moved on to someone more sophisticated. Grace Patterson, a registered nurse who had been Rebecca's roommate during nursing school at State University 7 years earlier, was refilling her coffee cup at the nurse's station when she heard a voice that stopped her cold. She hadn't seen Rebecca since the wedding invitation arrived 2 years ago, a lavish affair at the country club that Grace couldn't afford to attend, marking the end of a friendship that had once been as close as sisterhood. Grace immediately abandoned her coffee break and hurried toward the source of the commotion. Her nursing instincts and personal loyalty, both activated by the sound of her former best friend's name, being discussed so callously in a medical setting. This whole dramatic hospital visit is clearly a manipulation tactic, Vivian continued, apparently unconcerned that her voice was carrying throughout the emergency department. She saw Harrison kissing me and couldn't handle that he's found someone who actually appreciates his success and sophistication. So she manufactured a medical crisis to steal attention back to herself. Grace reached the waiting room in time to see Harrison pacing nervously, while a tall, perfectly groomed woman held court near the reception desk, speaking about Rebecca with the kind of casual cruelty that made Grace's professional and personal protective instincts flare simultaneously. But Grace's immediate priority was her patient and former friend, so she headed directly to room 3, where she found Rebecca hooked up to multiple monitors while Dr. Martinez reviewed her chart with growing concern. "Rebecca?" Grace said softly, stepping into the room. "Honey, is that really you?" Rebecca's face crumpled with relief at the sight of a genuinely friendly face. "Grace. Oh my God, Grace, I can't believe you're here. I didn't know you worked at Metropolitan General." 2 years now, Grace said, immediately moving to Rebecca's side and taking her hand with the easy intimacy of old friendship. "Emergency department, night shift. What happened tonight, sweetheart? And don't give me the sanitized version. Tell me what really happened." Through tears that she had been holding back since the ambulance ride, Rebecca told Grace about finding Harrison with Vivian, about the contractions that started from pure shock, about Harrison's 3 seconds of hesitation when asked to choose between his pregnant wife and his mistress. "That witch is still out there in the waiting room," Grace said, glancing toward the door with barely concealed disgust. "Acting like she has any right to be here, making pronouncements about your medical condition to anyone who'll listen. The audacity of that woman is absolutely breathtaking." Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly listening while reviewing Rebecca's test results, stepped forward with the kind of gentle authority that made her one of the most respected physicians in the hospital. "Rebecca, your blood pressure is stabilizing somewhat, but you're definitely developing preeclampsia," she said carefully. "The good news is that we caught it early, and your daughter appears to be handling the stress well. But I need you on complete bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy. Any additional stress could trigger premature labor or more serious complications." "How early are we talking about?" Rebecca asked, placing both hands protectively over her belly. 31 weeks, Dr. Martinez said. "If she were born today, she'd have an excellent chance of survival with proper NICU care. But every week she stays inside you makes her stronger. We want to get you to at least 37 weeks if possible." Meanwhile, Dr. Thomas Matthews was making his evening rounds through the emergency department, checking on the cases that had come in during the shift change and ensuring continuity of care for the patients who would remain overnight. At 52 years old, Thomas had been chief of staff at Metropolitan General for 8 years, a position he had earned through a combination of exceptional medical skill, administrative competence, and the kind of steady leadership that inspired confidence in both colleagues and patients. He was reviewing the evening's admissions on his tablet when a name on the patient board made him stop and read it twice. Rebecca Matthews. The name triggered a memory that made his chest tighten with concern and protective instinct. Rebecca Matthews had been his sister's daughter, the niece who had lived with Thomas and his wife Eleanor for 2 years during high school after her parents died in a car accident. They had walked her down the aisle at her wedding to Harrison Caldwell 3 years ago, a ceremony that had made Thomas privately uncomfortable due to the groom's obvious emotional distance and the bride's equally obvious anxiety about marrying into a family that valued wealth and status above genuine connection. Thomas had tried to stay out of his niece's marriage, respecting her independence and hoping his initial concerns about Harrison would prove unfounded. But seeing Rebecca's name on the emergency board with possible preeclampsia listed as her condition activated every protective instinct he had developed during 30 years of medical practice and 25 years of being the closest thing to a father Rebecca had known. He approached room 3 just as Harrison and Vivian appeared in the doorway, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere from medical calm to emotional tension. Thomas positioned himself where he could observe the interaction while remaining unobtrusive, his experienced eye taking in the dynamics between the three adults whose conflict was potentially endangering his pregnant niece. Vivian immediately launched into her familiar refrain about Rebecca's unnecessary dramatics and suggested that she was clearly fine now, since she was sitting up in bed and having what appeared to be a normal conversation with her nurse. Thomas observed the scene with the trained perception of someone who had spent 3 decades reading family dynamics during medical crises. He noted Vivian's possessive positioning near Harrison, the way she touched his arm while speaking as if to mark her territory. He saw Harrison's obvious guilt and discomfort, the way he avoided direct eye contact with Rebecca while simultaneously hovering near her bed with genuine concern. Most importantly, he recognized Rebecca's defeated posture, the way she seemed to be shrinking into herself despite being the patient who should have been the center of everyone's protective attention. "Rebecca, honey," Thomas said softly, entering the room with the easy authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of medical situations. "I saw your name on the board. I didn't know you were coming in tonight." Rebecca's face immediately transformed with relief and gratitude at seeing her uncle, the man who had held her during nightmares after her parents died, who had taught her to drive and helped her with college applications, who had given her away at her wedding with tears in his eyes and whispered prayers for her happiness. "Uncle Thomas," she said, her voice breaking with the kind of vulnerability she had been trying to hide from Harrison and Vivian. "I didn't know you were working tonight either. I'm so glad you're here." Thomas moved to her bedside with the practiced grace of a physician who had comforted thousands of patients and their families. But his attention was immediately drawn to the woman standing possessively near Harrison, speaking about Rebecca's medical condition with an authority she clearly didn't possess. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice carrying the polite but unmistakable tone of someone asking for clarification about an inappropriate situation. "Who is this woman, and why is she discussing my patient's medical condition?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, immediately shifting the power dynamics in the room. Harrison, recognizing that he was about to face judgment from a man whose opinion mattered to Rebecca, stepped forward with his businessman's instincts activated, but his confidence clearly shaken. "Dr. Matthews, this is Vivian Sterling, my marketing director," Harrison said, the words coming out more defensively than he had probably intended. "She was with me when Rebecca had her episode at my office tonight." "Episode?" Thomas repeated, his voice taking on the dangerously calm tone that his medical colleagues knew meant he was fighting to control his temper. "And you felt it was appropriate to bring your marketing director to your pregnant wife's hospital visit?" The silence that followed Thomas's question stretched for several heartbeats, filled with the mechanical sounds of medical monitors and the distant bustle of the emergency department beyond the room's walls. Harrison's face cycled through several expressions: surprise, guilt, defensiveness, and finally a dawning understanding that he had made a series of catastrophically poor decisions that were now being judged by one of the most powerful men in the hospital. "I mean," Harrison said, his voice losing its usual confident tone, "Vivian was concerned about Rebecca's well-being. She wanted to make sure Rebecca received appropriate medical care." Thomas slowly removed his stethoscope from around his neck and set it on the bedside table with deliberate precision, the gesture somehow more intimidating than any raised voice could have been. He had spent his entire career dealing with bullies, manipulators, and people who used their wealth or status to intimidate medical staff, and he recognized Vivian Sterling's type immediately. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," Thomas said, his voice maintaining the same professionally calm tone that he used when delivering difficult diagnoses. "Your pregnant wife came to your office and found you in a compromising position with this woman? The shock of that discovery triggered a medical emergency that required ambulance transport to the hospital. And your response was to bring the woman your wife found you with to her hospital room." When Thomas laid out the sequence of events in stark clinical terms, the sheer inappropriateness of Harrison's choices became impossible to deny or justify. Grace, who had been quietly monitoring Rebecca's vital signs, looked up with barely concealed disgust at Harrison's obvious discomfort. But Vivian Sterling, either too arrogant or too sociopathic to recognize the danger of the situation she was in, chose that moment to double down on her aggressive approach, rather than retreat with whatever dignity she might have preserved. "Well, Dr. Matthews," Vivian said with the false sweetness that poorly concealed her irritation at being questioned by anyone, "maybe you should know the full story before you start making judgments. Your niece has been nothing but trouble for Harrison. She's clearly trying to trap him with this pregnancy, and now she's manufacturing medical emergencies to get attention whenever she feels like their relationship isn't going her way." The machines monitoring Rebecca's vital signs immediately began beeping faster as her blood pressure spiked in response to Vivian's verbal attack. Thomas noticed the change instantly, his medical training overriding his personal feelings, as he recognized that his patient was being caused actual physical distress by this woman's presence. "Grace," Thomas said calmly, never taking his eyes off Vivian, "can you please adjust Mrs. Caldwell's position and check her IV? Her blood pressure is responding to stress factors in the room." Grace immediately moved to comply, her nursing training making her an expert at recognizing and responding to patient distress. As she adjusted Rebecca's bed and checked the IV line, she positioned herself between Rebecca and Vivian in a subtle but unmistakable protective gesture. "Ma'am," Grace said firmly, addressing Vivian directly for the first time, "your voice is elevated and you're causing medical distress to my patient. I'm going to need you to lower your voice and step back from the bed." But Vivian was too committed to her attack to recognize the professional warnings she was being given. In her experience, intimidation and manipulation had always worked eventually, and she wasn't prepared to back down from what she saw as a challenge to her authority over the situation. "Medical distress?" Vivian laughed, the sound sharp and ugly in the confined space of the hospital room. "Look at her. She's sitting up talking. She's obviously fine. This whole thing is just theater designed to manipulate Harrison into feeling guilty about finally finding someone who appreciates what an amazing man he is." Thomas had spent decades learning to control his temper in crisis situations, developing the kind of professional calm that allowed him to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. But something about this woman's callous disregard for his pregnant niece's well-being, combined with her obvious pleasure in causing emotional pain to a vulnerable patient, pushed him past his usual tolerance for difficult family members. "Ms. Sterling," Thomas said, and his voice carried the full weight of 30 years of medical authority and administrative power, "preeclampsia is a potentially fatal condition that affects both mother and child. Elevated stress levels are a major contributing factor to complications that can result in seizures, organ failure, or death. Your presence in this room is medically contraindicated, and I'm asking you to leave." Harrison, finally beginning to understand the gravity of both his wife's medical condition and the social situation he had created, made a half-hearted attempt to diffuse the tension that was clearly escalating beyond his control. "Vivian," he said quietly, "maybe you should wait in the car. I can handle this situation from here." But Vivian Sterling had not built her career by accepting dismissal from anyone, especially not when she felt her relationship with Harrison was being threatened by what she still believed was Rebecca's calculated manipulation of the medical system. "I'm not going anywhere," she declared, with the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of will. "Harrison needs someone rational here to make sure he doesn't get emotionally manipulated by fake tears and manufactured symptoms. I'm not leaving him alone with someone who's obviously willing to fake medical emergencies to get attention." That statement marked the moment when Grace Patterson decided she had heard enough. As Rebecca's friend and as a registered nurse with legal and ethical obligations to protect her patients, she had both personal and professional reasons to remove this woman from the medical environment. "Ma'am," Grace said, her voice taking on the firm authority that nurses developed when dealing with disruptive family members, "you are causing documented medical distress to my patient. Her blood pressure has spiked significantly since you began speaking. I need you to step outside immediately." "Don't you dare try to tell me what to do," Vivian snapped, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal the rage underneath. "Do you have any idea who I am? Do you understand who you're talking to?" Grace, who had spent 7 years dealing with entitled family members, abusive partners, and people who thought their wealth or status gave them the right to terrorize medical staff, stood her ground with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what her professional obligations were. "Ma'am, I know exactly what I'm looking at," Grace said steadily, "and I'm telling you that you need to leave this room now, or I'll call security to escort you out." What happened next would be burned into everyone's memory as the moment when Vivian Sterling revealed her true nature and ensured that she would face serious criminal consequences for her behavior. "Don't touch me!" Vivian screamed and delivered a deliberate two-handed shove to Grace's shoulders that sent the nurse stumbling backward toward Rebecca's bed. Grace, caught completely off balance by the unexpected physical assault, fell against Rebecca's bed with enough force to cause the entire structure to shift. The sudden movement caused Rebecca to slide sideways as she instinctively tried to protect her pregnant belly, and the IV stand toppled over with a metallic crash that brought medical staff running from throughout the emergency department. But Vivian Sterling wasn't finished demonstrating the depth of her cruelty and the extent of her willingness to hurt a pregnant woman to make her point. As Rebecca struggled to regain her footing, clearly disoriented and frightened by the sudden physical chaos that had erupted around her hospital bed, Vivian saw not a vulnerable pregnant woman in medical distress, but an opportunity to deliver a message that would establish her dominance once and for all. "Stop being so dramatic," Vivian shouted, her voice carrying the kind of rage that revealed years of suppressed anger and jealousy. And then, with deliberate and unmistakable intent, she kicked Rebecca hard in the shin as Rebecca was trying to stand up. Rebecca fell hard onto her side on the hospital floor, crying out in pain as the impact sent shockwaves through her pregnant belly. The fetal monitor alarm immediately began wailing as their daughter's heartbeat became erratic in response to the trauma and stress. Thomas Matthews had witnessed many shocking things during his 30-year medical career, but watching someone deliberately assault his pregnant niece in a hospital room triggered something that went far beyond his professional training and activated the most primitive, protective instincts he possessed. "Security!" Thomas called, his voice carrying through the emergency department with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Security to room 3, stat." Harrison, finally understanding what he was witnessing, grabbed Vivian's arm with enough force to leave marks. "What the hell is wrong with you? Are you completely insane?" But even as she was being physically restrained by the man she claimed to love, Vivian wasn't finished delivering her message to the woman she saw as her rival and obstacle. As security officers appeared in the doorway and Dr. Martinez rushed in with a team of medical personnel, Vivian leaned over Rebecca, who was struggling to get back onto the bed while protecting her belly, and delivered her final verbal assault with the precision of someone who knew exactly how to inflict maximum psychological damage. "You'll never be enough for him," Vivian said with vicious clarity, her voice carrying clearly through the room despite the medical chaos erupting around them. "He comes to my apartment every night because looking at you disgusts him. You're pathetic and desperate, and after tonight, everyone will know it." Rebecca started bleeding. The combination of physical trauma from the fall and extreme emotional distress had triggered exactly the kind of complication that Dr. Martinez had been trying to prevent. And suddenly the room exploded into the controlled urgency that marked a genuine obstetric emergency. "Possible placental abruption," Dr. Martinez called out as the medical team lifted Rebecca back onto the bed with practiced efficiency. "I need to get her to OR2 immediately. Call anesthesia and have the NICU team standing by in case we need to deliver this baby tonight." As Rebecca was wheeled towards surgery, she managed to grab Thomas's hand with surprising strength, her eyes wide with the terror of a mother who might be about to lose her child. "Don't let them take my baby, Uncle Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the medical equipment and rushing personnel. "Please don't let anything happen to her." Thomas squeezed her hand and made the kind of promise that doctors weren't supposed to make, but sometimes did anyway when family was involved. "I won't let anything happen to either of you, sweetheart. I promise." Then he turned to face the security chief with the deadly calm that his colleagues recognized as Thomas Matthews at his most dangerous. "I want that woman arrested for assault on a pregnant patient," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of his position as chief of staff and his authority as a witness to everything that had just occurred. "I witnessed the entire incident, and I'll testify to every detail of what she did to my niece." As Vivian Sterling was handcuffed by hospital security, She was still screaming her justifications and threats, apparently unable to understand that her actions had crossed lines that wealth and connections couldn't uncross. "You can't arrest me!" she shrieked, struggling against the restraints, as if her indignation alone could reverse the consequences of her choices. "I'm Vivian Sterling. My father owns 3 hospitals. This is all just a misunderstanding." Thomas looked her directly in the eyes with the calm certainty of someone who had spent his career fighting for patients who couldn't fight for themselves. "Your father doesn't own this one," he said simply. "And in this hospital, assaulting pregnant patients has consequences." The operating room had been prepared with the kind of controlled urgency that distinguished genuine medical emergencies from routine procedures. Rebecca lay on the surgical table surrounded by the soft beeping of monitors and the quiet efficiency of Dr. Martinez's team as they worked to assess the damage from what was now being officially documented as a criminal assault on a pregnant patient. Thomas scrubbed in despite not being the attending physician, his presence in the OR both unusual and entirely understandable given the circumstances. Dr. Martinez, who had worked with Thomas for 8 years and respected both his medical judgment and his administrative authority, welcomed his participation without question. "This is my family," Thomas said simply when Dr. Martinez raised an eyebrow at his presence, and she nodded with complete understanding. In situations like this, personal connections often brought out the absolute best in medical teams, creating a level of dedication and care that went beyond professional obligation. The ultrasound machine was wheeled into position, and Rebecca held her breath as the technician moved the wand across her belly, searching for the reassuring sound of her daughter's heartbeat. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds, during which Rebecca's mind raced through every worst-case scenario she had learned during her nursing training. "There," Dr. Martinez said with audible relief, pointing to the monitor where a strong, steady heartbeat pulsed in perfect rhythm. "Beautiful heartbeat, normal rate. Baby's position looks good, no signs of distress. Rebecca, I think we caught this situation before it could develop into serious complications." Rebecca started crying, not from pain or fear, but from overwhelming relief and gratitude that her daughter had survived Vivian's attack without apparent harm. "She's really okay. The kick didn't hurt her?" "She's more than okay," Dr. Martinez assured her, studying the ultrasound images with the practiced eye of someone who had interpreted thousands of similar scans. "Your body did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected her from the trauma. The bleeding appears to be from stress and the physical impact of your fall, not from placental abruption or other serious complications." Dr. Martinez continued her examination while explaining her findings to both Rebecca and Thomas, her voice carrying the kind of cautious optimism that experienced physicians used when delivering good news that came with important qualifications. "However," she continued, "we need to keep you under close observation for the rest of your pregnancy. What happened tonight, both the physical assault and the extreme emotional trauma, could have triggered premature labor or other complications. Any additional incidents like this could endanger both you and your daughter." Meanwhile, in the emergency department waiting room, Harrison paced in tight circles while Vivian sat in a chair with her hands cuffed behind her back, still maintaining her innocence, despite the fact that 6 hospital staff members, 2 security guards, and the chief of staff had witnessed her assault on a pregnant woman in a medical setting. The emergency department had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, with police officers taking statements from witnesses and hospital security preserving video evidence of the assault. Detective Maria Santos, a specialist in domestic violence cases who had been called in specifically because of the nature of the incident, was methodically documenting everything with a thoroughness that came from years of building cases against people who hurt vulnerable victims. "This is absolutely ridiculous." Securing, Vivian continued to rant to anyone within hearing distance, apparently unable to grasp that her protests of innocence were being contradicted by overwhelming evidence. "She fell on her own. Everyone saw her fall. This whole thing is just a setup to make me look bad." But the security footage told a completely different story, and Thomas had already requested that all surveillance video from the evening be preserved as legal evidence. The hospital's camera system had captured not just the deliberate kick that constituted criminal assault, but also Vivian's earlier pattern of aggressive behavior, her verbal threats, her physical confrontation with Grace, and her obvious intent to cause harm to a pregnant patient. Sam Morrison, Harrison's business partner and closest friend since college, arrived 30 minutes after Grace called him with news of the situation. Sam had been Harrison's best man at the wedding 3 years earlier, and he had watched his friend's marriage deteriorate over the past 18 months with growing concern and frustration. He took one look at the chaos in the emergency department, police officers, hospital security, his business partner looking like he was about to have a nervous breakdown, and a woman in handcuffs still making threats, and immediately understood that this wasn't just a marital problem anymore. Harrison, Sam said quietly, pulling his friend aside to a corner of the waiting room where they could speak with relative privacy. What in God's name have you done? I didn't know this would happen, Harrison said, his voice hollow with shock and dawning understanding of the magnitude of his situation. I never thought she would actually hurt Rebecca. I never imagined she was capable of something like this. Edgecombe. Sam stared at his friend with a mixture of disbelief and disgust that marked the end of years of making excuses for Harrison's behavior. You brought your mistress to your pregnant wife's hospital room. What exactly did you think would happen? Harrison had no answer for that question, because the truth was that he had been so focused on managing his own guilt and discomfort that he hadn't considered how his choices would affect anyone else, including the woman carrying his child. The board is going to hear about this, Sam continued, his voice taking on the hard edge of someone delivering news that would change everything. This kind of scandal doesn't stay quiet. You're about to lose everything. Your marriage, your reputation, probably your position with the company. Eleanor Matthews arrived 45 minutes after receiving Thomas's emergency text, having driven directly from the nonprofit board meeting where she had been discussing funding for domestic violence prevention programs. At 55 years old, Eleanor was a retired social worker who had spent 30 years advocating for women and children in crisis situations, and she possessed the kind of moral authority that came from decades of fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She took one look at Vivian being processed for assault charges and Harrison's obvious guilt and panic, and her expression hardened into the look that had intimidated abusive husbands, negligent fathers, and corrupt officials for 3 decades of professional advocacy work. Thomas texted that Rebecca was hurt, Eleanor said to Harrison, her voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. He didn't mention it was because her husband brought his girlfriend to physically attack her in a hospital. Harrison tried to stammer some kind of explanation or justification, but Eleanor held up her hand with the gesture she had perfected during thousands of confrontations with people who had hurt the vulnerable clients she had spent her career protecting. Don't, she said simply, don't insult my intelligence by pretending this was some kind of accident or misunderstanding. That woman deliberately assaulted my pregnant niece in a hospital room while you stood there and watched. Dr. Martinez emerged from the surgical area with the cautiously good news that everyone had been hoping for, but hadn't dared expect given the circumstances of the evening. Rebecca and the baby were stable, with no signs of serious complications from the assault, but the next few months would be critical for ensuring a safe delivery. Mrs. Caldwell and her daughter are stable, Dr. Martinez announced to the group that had gathered in the waiting area. We found no evidence of placental abruption or fetal distress. However, she'll need complete bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. Any additional physical or emotional stress could trigger premature labor or other serious complications. Eleanor stepped closer to Harrison, and despite being barely 5 feet tall, she somehow managed to be more intimidating than men twice her size had ever been. So here's what's going to happen, Eleanor said with the voice she had used on 1,000 deadbeat fathers and abusive partners over the course of her career. You're going to make a choice right now about whether you want to be a father to this child or just another man who abandoned his family when things got complicated. Harrison stared at her, apparently unable to process what she was telling him. What do you mean, choice? Of course I want to be a father. Son, Eleanor said with the kind of patience she reserved for people who were too stupid or selfish to understand the obvious. Your girlfriend just physically assaulted your pregnant wife in a hospital. If you think any family court judge in this state is going to grant you unsupervised access to a child after this incident, you're even more deluded than you appear. The weight of Eleanor's words hit Harrison like a physical blow as he began to understand that this wasn't just a marriage problem or even a criminal matter. This was about his fundamental right to be involved in his daughter's life. Vivian, overhearing Eleanor's explanation of the legal consequences that Harrison was facing, exploded in fresh outrage that revealed just how divorced from reality her understanding of the situation had become. "That's completely ridiculous," she shouted from her position in the hard plastic chair where she was waiting to be transported to jail. "I barely touched that manipulative little fraud. She's obviously faking the whole thing to make herself look like some kind of victim." Eleanor turned to look at Vivian with the expression she had developed over 30 years of dealing with the absolute worst examples of human behavior that society had to offer. "Honey," she said with the calm certainty of someone who had documented hundreds of abuse cases, "I've been working with victims of domestic violence since before you were born. I know exactly what I'm looking at, and what I'm looking at is a woman who attacked a pregnant patient in a hospital because she was jealous of a marriage that was already ending." Detective Santos finished taking statements from all the witnesses and approached the group with the kind of professional gravity that indicated serious criminal charges were being filed. "Mr. Caldwell," Detective Santos said, addressing Harrison directly, "I want you to understand that this case is going to proceed regardless of your wife's wishes or your family's preferences. Assault on a pregnant woman in a medical setting is a felony in this state, and we have multiple witnesses and video evidence of the attack." As Vivian Sterling was finally led away in handcuffs, still screaming threats and justifications, Rebecca was being moved from surgery to a private room where she would spend the next several days under observation. The criminal case against Vivian was already being built, but the larger questions about Harrison's marriage, his relationship with his daughter, and his future were just beginning to be addressed. Thomas looked at the legal and medical team that was assembling around his niece and realized they weren't just dealing with a single incident of violence. They were confronting an entire system that had allowed a wealthy, connected woman to believe she could assault a pregnant patient without consequences. This time, that system was going to work for the victim instead of the perpetrator. The next morning brought a media storm that neither Harrison nor his expensive public relations team had anticipated. The story of a billionaire's mistress assaulting his pregnant wife in a hospital had captured public attention in a way that transcended typical society page gossip, touching on issues of domestic violence, wealth inequality, and the vulnerability of pregnant women that resonated with audiences far beyond the usual celebrity scandal demographics. "Billionaire's mistress charged with hospital assault on pregnant wife," read the headline in the morning edition of the city's largest newspaper, accompanied by a photograph of Vivian being led away in handcuffs and a smaller image of Rebecca being wheeled into the ambulance. The story painted a clear narrative of an entitled woman whose jealousy had driven her to attack a defenseless pregnant patient in a medical setting. Harrison's business was feeling the impact before the markets even opened. 3 major clients called before 8 a.m. to postpone their development projects pending resolution of the scandal. The board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon to discuss Harrison's future with the company he had built from his father's modest construction business into a billion-dollar real estate empire. But Harrison was discovering that his business problems were the least of his concerns. Rebecca had awakened in her hospital room surrounded by an army of protectors who had assembled overnight to ensure her safety and her daughter's well-being, creating a network of support that rivaled anything his wealth and connections could provide. Grace had arranged her schedule to work double shifts so she could personally oversee Rebecca's care. Thomas had moved his office hours to the evening so he could spend his days coordinating with the medical team treating his niece. Eleanor had arrived with a suitcase, having informed the hospital administration that she would be staying in Rebecca's room until her niece was discharged. Most surprisingly, Harrison's own mother had driven through the night from her estate in the Hamptons, arriving at dawn with the kind of grim determination that indicated she was prepared to take sides in a family conflict that could define the rest of their relationships. Margaret Caldwell was a woman who had built her adult life around maintaining appearances, protecting her family's reputation, and navigating the complex social expectations of inherited wealth. But she was also a mother who had spent 68 years learning to distinguish between genuine character and superficial charm, and what she had witnessed the previous evening had clarified her priorities in ways that surprised even her. "Rebecca, dear," Margaret said, taking her daughter-in-law's hand with uncharacteristic warmth. I want you to know that what happened last night was not how I raise my son, and it's not what I want for my granddaughter. Rebecca was genuinely surprised by this support from a woman who had always been polite, but emotionally distant, maintaining the kind of formal relationship that seemed to emphasize the class differences between Rebecca's middle-class nursing background and the Caldwell family's generational wealth. Mrs. Caldwell, Rebecca said carefully, you don't need to apologize for Harrison's choices. Those were his decisions to make. Yes, I do need to apologize, Margaret said with surprising firmness. I saw the signs that something was wrong in your marriage. I noticed Harrison's emotional distance, his increasing focus on work at the expense of his family, his obvious discomfort with the responsibilities of impending fatherhood. I chose to stay silent because I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. Margaret paused to gather her thoughts, clearly struggling with admissions that went against a lifetime of maintaining family privacy and avoiding uncomfortable conversations. But my silence made me complicit, she continued. By not warning you about what I was seeing, by not confronting Harrison about his behavior, by not taking steps to protect you and my granddaughter, I failed in my obligations as both a mother-in-law and a grandmother. Doctor, Martinez arrived for her morning rounds with news that Rebecca's condition had stabilized overnight, but the next few months would be critical for ensuring both her health and the baby's continued development. Your blood pressure has come down significantly, which is excellent news, Dr. Martinez explained while reviewing the overnight monitoring reports. But you're going to need complete bed rest for the remainder of your pregnancy. No work, no stress, no physical activity beyond basic daily care. Any deviation from this regimen could trigger the kind of complications we managed to avoid last night. Jessica Reynolds, the hospital social worker who specialized in domestic violence cases, arrived to document everything for Rebecca's protection and to connect her with legal resources that would ensure her rights were protected throughout the criminal proceedings against Vivian. Rebecca, Jessica said gently, sitting beside the hospital bed with the calm professionalism that came from years of helping women navigate crisis situations. I want to make sure you understand that you have options and resources available to you. What happened last night wasn't your fault, and you don't have to face the consequences alone. Jessica explained the legal process that would follow Vivian's assault charges, the protective services available for pregnant women in domestic violence situations, and the family law resources that would help Rebecca navigate potential custody issues if her marriage ended. Most importantly, Jessica said, I want you to know that your financial security and your daughter's future don't depend on staying in a relationship where you're not safe and respected. There are ways to protect both of you that don't require you to accept unacceptable behavior from anyone. Harrison arrived at the hospital that evening, not as a husband demanding his rights, but as a man who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had lost and the work he would need to do to earn any chance at redemption. He found Rebecca's room filled with the people who had become her protective circle. Thomas reviewing medical charts, Eleanor coordinating with social services, Grace adjusting IV medications, Jessica documenting everything for legal purposes, and Margaret holding Rebecca's hand while they discussed baby names and nursery plans. The formation around Rebecca's bed made it clear that Harrison was there by invitation rather than by right, and that his presence was being evaluated rather than automatically welcomed. Rebecca, Harrison said quietly from the doorway, I need to talk to you, if that's okay. Talk, Rebecca said simply, her voice carrying none of the desperation or pleading that had characterized their recent conversations. She was too exhausted for anger and too heartbroken for hope, but she was also surrounded by people who had made it clear that she didn't have to face this alone. I can't undo what I've done, Harrison said, and for the first time in their 3-year marriage, his voice carried complete honesty rather than calculated charm or defensive justification. I can't undo bringing Vivian into our lives. I can't undo the choices that led to her hurting you and endangering our daughter. I can't undo the 3 seconds when I hesitated to choose you over her. He paused, seeming to gather courage for what he needed to say next. But I want you to know that I'm not asking for your forgiveness until I've done the work to earn it. I'm not asking you to make any decisions about our marriage until I've proven that I'm capable of being the husband and father that you and our daughter deserve. Sure, Rebecca studied his face, looking for the manipulation and self-serving promises that had characterized most of their serious conversations over the past year. Instead, she saw something she hadn't expected: genuine humility and what appeared to be authentic remorse. "What does that mean specifically?" she asked. "It means I've already contacted Dr. Sarah Chen, who specializes in therapy for men who've committed emotional abuse," Harrison said, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of these admissions. "I'll be seeing her twice a week, individually, to understand how I became capable of the choices I made last night." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged surprised looks. This wasn't the response they had expected from Harrison, who had always seemed more interested in managing the optics of problems than addressing their underlying causes. "I'm also joining a group program for people who want to understand how they became capable of hurting the people they claim to love," Harrison continued. "I know that sounds like corporate therapy or public relations management, but I've spoken with Dr. Chen extensively, and she doesn't work with people who aren't committed to genuine change." Margaret reached over to squeeze Rebecca's hand, her expression showing a mixture of hope and caution that reflected her own complicated feelings about her son's promises. "I've already spoken with my attorneys about setting up a trust fund that will ensure you and our daughter are financially secure, regardless of what happens to our marriage or my business," Harrison added. "You'll never have to depend on me financially, which means that if you ever choose to give me another chance, it will be because you want to, not because you need to." Shishana. Rebecca felt their daughter kick, as if responding to her father's voice, and the emotional intensity of the conversation happening around her. "Harrison," Rebecca said quietly, "I loved you. I really, truly loved you. But love isn't enough when there's no trust left, and I don't know if trust can be rebuilt after what happened." "I know," Harrison said, and his acceptance of that reality was perhaps the most encouraging thing he had said. "I'm not asking you to trust me now. I don't deserve that. I'm asking you to let me try to become someone worth trusting again, even if that work doesn't lead to reconciliation." Eleanor, who had spent 30 years evaluating whether people were genuinely committed to change or just managing the consequences of their behavior, spoke up with a question that surprised everyone in the room. "What kind of therapy?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose professional opinion on this matter was worth considering. "Individual sessions with Dr. Sarah Chen focus on understanding the psychological patterns that led to my emotional abuse of Rebecca," Harrison answered, clearly having prepared for this kind of scrutiny. "The group program is specifically for men who've betrayed their families and want to understand how they became capable of that level of selfishness and cruelty." Margaret, who had remained silent during most of this conversation, finally spoke with the kind of moral clarity that had been missing from the Caldwell family for too long. "Whatever you decide, Rebecca," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 68 years of experience and the authority of someone who controlled significant financial resources, "you and my granddaughter will have my complete support. If Harrison proves that he's genuinely changed, we'll welcome that. If he doesn't, you'll still be family, and you'll still be protected." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Rebecca felt like she had real choices instead of just survival options. The question now was whether Harrison's promises represented genuine change or just more sophisticated manipulation designed to minimize the consequences of his betrayal. Only time would tell, but at least now Rebecca had the resources and support to make whatever decision was truly best for her and her daughter, rather than whatever decision seemed least dangerous in the moment. Over the next 2 weeks, Rebecca's hospital room became the unlikely headquarters for what could only be described as a protective campaign orchestrated by people who had decided that wealth and status would not be allowed to triumph over justice and basic human decency. The network that assembled around her represented a cross-section of the city's most influential advocates, medical professionals, and community leaders, all united by their determination to ensure that a pregnant woman who had been assaulted would receive every possible protection and resource. Grace coordinated with the nursing administration to ensure Rebecca received what amounted to VIP medical care without the hospital billing for enhanced services. The nursing staff, many of whom had heard about the assault through the hospital's informal communication network, took personal interest in Rebecca's recovery and went out of their way to provide emotional support along with medical care. Thomas used his position as chief of staff to ensure that Rebecca's case became a teaching example for how hospitals should respond to domestic violence situations involving pregnant patients. He arranged for Jessica Reynolds to present Rebecca's case to medical students and resident physicians as an example of comprehensive victim advocacy in medical settings. Eleanor transformed her temporary residence in Rebecca's room into a command center for coordinating legal, social, and financial support services. She contacted every domestic violence organization in the state to ensure Rebecca had access to the best legal representation available, regardless of her ability to pay for it. Most surprisingly, Margaret Caldwell had quietly contacted her family's attorneys to establish a trust fund that would ensure Rebecca's financial independence, regardless of what happened to Harrison's business or their marriage. The fund was structured to provide for Rebecca's education, housing, medical care, and the baby's future expenses, eliminating any financial pressure to reconcile with Harrison for practical reasons. "I want my granddaughter to grow up knowing that women in our family are protected and valued," Margaret explained when Rebecca protested the generosity of the arrangement. "If Harrison earns his way back into your lives, it should be because you choose to welcome him, not because you need his money." The media attention surrounding the case had brought an unexpected development that transformed Rebecca's personal crisis into a broader social movement. Women from across the country began writing to Rebecca care of the hospital, sharing their own stories of violence during pregnancy and expressing gratitude that someone with access to legal resources and media attention was speaking publicly about the vulnerability of expectant mothers. Eleanor, who had spent her career advocating for policy changes to protect vulnerable populations, recognized an opportunity to turn Rebecca's trauma into lasting social change. She organized a press conference to announce new legislation that would create enhanced penalties for assault on pregnant women and establish protocols for hospitals to better protect expectant mothers from domestic violence. "Rebecca's story isn't unique," Eleanor told the assembled reporters and television cameras. "What's unique is that she had family members with the resources and connections to ensure justice was pursued. Every day, pregnant women face violence from partners and others who target them specifically because pregnancy makes them vulnerable. We're going to use this case to make sure other women have the same protections Rebecca received." The legislation, which quickly became known as the Rebecca Act, gained support from women's advocacy groups, medical associations, and law enforcement organizations throughout the state. Rebecca found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to start, transforming her private trauma into public purpose in ways that gave meaning to her suffering. Harrison, meanwhile, was discovering that genuine behavioral change was more difficult and painful than he had anticipated when he made his promises to Rebecca. Dr. Sarah Chen's therapy sessions forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his character, his marriage, and his fundamental understanding of relationships and responsibility. "You didn't just have an affair," Dr. Chen told him during one particularly difficult session. "You brought your affair partner into your wife's medical emergency and allowed her to abuse your pregnant wife. We need to understand how you became capable of that level of betrayal and callousness." The group therapy sessions were even more challenging, as listening to other men describe their patterns of emotional abuse, manipulation, and betrayal helped Harrison recognize behaviors in himself that he had previously rationalized or ignored. "I always told myself that I worked long hours and focused on building wealth because I was providing for my family," Harrison admitted during one group session. "But the truth is that I used work as an excuse to avoid the emotional intimacy that marriage required. When Rebecca needed me to be present and engaged, I chose to be anywhere else." Dr. Chen helped him understand that his affair with Vivian hadn't been about attraction or passion. It had been about power and control. Vivian had made him feel successful and important without requiring the vulnerability and genuine connection that Rebecca had been asking for throughout their marriage. "Vivian never challenged me to be a better person," Harrison realized during another session. "She just told me I was already perfect. Rebecca challenged me to grow, to be emotionally available, to take responsibility for my behavior. I chose the relationship that required less from me." Rebecca, still confined to bed rest but no longer in immediate medical danger, used her time to pursue online courses toward a master's degree in healthcare administration with a specialization in patient advocacy. She had found her calling in helping other women navigate medical and legal systems during crisis situations. I want to make sure that other women in my situation have someone who understands what they're going through, she told Thomas during one of his daily visits. I want to be the person I needed when this was happening to me. Thomas watched his niece transform her trauma into purpose and recognized the kind of strength that could change systems and save lives. You're already helping people just by speaking publicly about what happened to you, he said. He watched the women who've written to you, the legislation Eleanor is pushing, the changes in how we handle domestic violence cases in the hospital. You're already making a difference. Margaret had become a regular presence in Rebecca's room, often bringing books, magazines, and baby clothes she had purchased during what appeared to be therapeutic shopping expeditions. During one visit, she made an admission that surprised everyone. I knew Harrison was having an affair, Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of regret and self-recrimination. I saw the signs, the late nights that weren't accounted for by work, the emotional distance from you, the way he seemed to be avoiding his responsibilities as an expectant father. But I chose not to interfere because I told myself it wasn't my business. Rebecca was genuinely shocked by this revelation. Mrs. Caldwell, even if you had said something, I don't think it would have prevented what Vivian did. Maybe not, Margaret admitted, but I could have warned you. I could have prepared you for what might happen. I could have made sure you knew you had support in options before you found yourself in a crisis situation. Instead, I protected my son's reputation at the expense of your safety, and I'll regret that choice for the rest of my life. Meanwhile, Vivian Sterling was learning that jail was a very different environment from the privileged world where her family's wealth and connections had always protected her from the consequences of her behavior. Her cellmate was a woman named Carmen Rodriguez, who had been arrested for defending herself against an abusive boyfriend and was awaiting trial on charges that would determine whether her act of self-defense would be recognized by the legal system. So you're the rich girl who beat up a pregnant lady, Carmen said with obvious disgust after learning about Vivian's case from news coverage that had reached even the jail's limited television access. You're going to be real popular in here once word gets around about what you did. Vivian tried to maintain her superiority and entitlement even in jail, apparently unable to grasp how her circumstances had fundamentally changed. I didn't beat up anyone, she said defensively. She was faking the whole thing for attention. I barely touched her. Carmen, who had survived years of actual domestic violence before finally defending herself against her attacker, laughed bitterly at Vivian's self-serving version of events. Honey, I've heard that exact story from every abuser in here, Carmen said. They all think they're the real victim right up until the judge sentences them. But kicking a pregnant woman in a hospital? Even the worst ones in here think that's low. Out on bail thanks to her father's political connections and expensive legal team, Vivian made a decision that would prove to be her second crucial mistake and would add serious charges to her already substantial legal problems. Convinced that she could discredit Rebecca and somehow reverse the consequences of her assault, she approached Maria Santos, a hospital orderly who cleaned rooms in the maternity ward. Maria Santos was a single mother whose 8-year-old son had been treated by Thomas Matthews 5 years earlier when the boy suffered a severe asthma attack that nearly killed him. Thomas had not only saved her son's life, but had also helped Maria navigate the complex insurance and billing issues that threatened to bankrupt her family. She considered Dr. Matthews and Metropolitan General Hospital to be the reason her son was alive. When Vivian approached her with an offer of $5,000 in cash to hide a small bag of cocaine in Rebecca's hospital room, Maria immediately understood that she was being asked to participate in a scheme designed to destroy the reputation and legal credibility of the pregnant woman who had been assaulted by this wealthy, entitled criminal. You want me to plant drugs on the lady who got beat up? Maria asked, making sure she understood exactly what was being proposed to her. It's not like that, Vivian said with the kind of casual confidence that came from a lifetime of successful manipulation. She's not really a victim. She's been lying about everything, and this would just help the truth come out. Think about it, $5,000 for 5 minutes of work. Maria looked at this woman, who had already demonstrated her willingness to assault pregnant patients, and realized she was now witnessing an attempt to frame someone for drug possession in order to escape accountability for violent crime. I need to think about it, Maria said, pretending to consider the offer while actually planning to report it immediately to hospital security and police. Within an hour of Vivian's departure, Maria had contacted both hospital administration and Detective Santos with a detailed account of the attempted bribery. The conversation had been recorded on Maria's phone, providing clear evidence of Vivian's attempt to manufacture evidence against Rebecca. Detective Santos arrived at the hospital within 2 hours of receiving Maria's report, bringing with her a recording device and a plan to document Vivian's criminal behavior if she attempted to follow through on her scheme. Ms. Sterling just made this case very simple for the prosecutor, Detective Santos told Thomas after reviewing Maria's statement and the recording of Vivian's bribery attempt. Trying to plant drugs on a pregnant woman in a hospital to discredit her testimony in an assault case is going to add witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and solicitation charges to her existing problems. Thomas looked at the evidence that was accumulating against the woman who had attacked his niece and realized that Vivian Sterling's arrogance and sense of entitlement were ensuring that she would face the full legal consequences of her behavior. "How many years is she looking at now?" he asked. "With the original assault charges, the attempted evidence tampering, and her complete lack of remorse, she's looking at serious prison time," Detective Santos answered. "Her father's connections might help her avoid the maximum sentence, but she's going to jail." Why? That evening, Harrison visited Rebecca's room with news that would fundamentally change the trajectory of their relationship and their daughter's future. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something important about what I've learned in therapy and what I've decided about our future." The preliminary hearing for Vivian Sterling's assault charges drew media attention from across 3 states, transforming a local criminal case into a national conversation about violence against pregnant women, the abuse of wealth and privilege, and the responsibility of institutions to protect vulnerable patients. The courthouse steps were lined with women's rights advocates, domestic violence survivors, and reporters who recognized that this case had implications far beyond the individuals involved. Vivian's father, Charles Sterling, had assembled the most expensive legal team that money could buy. Led by Marcus Webb, a defense attorney whose reputation for getting wealthy clients out of serious legal trouble was matched only by his willingness to use any tactic, however unethical, to achieve victory for his clients. But they faced a mountain of evidence that grew higher with each passing day. Security footage from multiple angles showed Vivian's deliberate assault on Rebecca. Medical records documented the injuries and trauma. Witness statements from 6 hospital staff members corroborated every detail of the attack. And now, thanks to Vivian's own arrogance, they also had attempted bribery charges supported by recorded conversations and additional witness testimony. Prosecutor Janet Morrison had built her career on cases involving violence against women and children, and she recognized that Rebecca's case offered an opportunity to establish legal precedents that would protect other vulnerable victims. She approached the prosecution with the kind of methodical preparation that had made her one of the most respected prosecutors in the state. "Your Honor," Morrison said during the preliminary hearing, "the defendant didn't just assault Mrs. Caldwell once. The evidence shows a pattern of escalating aggressive behavior that culminated in the deliberate assault of a pregnant patient in a hospital room, followed by attempts to destroy the victim's credibility through evidence tampering." Morrison played the security footage that showed Vivian's progression from verbal abuse to physical confrontation with Grace to the deliberate kick that sent Rebecca falling to the floor. Then she presented the recorded evidence of Vivian's attempt to bribe a hospital employee to plant drugs in Rebecca's room. "This wasn't an emotional outburst or a moment of poor judgment," Morrison continued. "This was calculated violence, followed by calculated attempts to escape accountability through witness intimidation and evidence manipulation." Marcus Webb tried to argue that his client was the real victim, manipulated by Harrison's family situation and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. But Judge Patricia Hernandez, who had presided over domestic violence cases for 15 years, was not impressed by attempts to blame the victim for her attacker's behavior. "Ms. Sterling," Judge Hernandez said, reviewing the evidence with obvious disgust, "you attacked a pregnant woman in a hospital room, then attempted to frame that same woman for drug possession to discredit her testimony against you. This court finds your behavior not just criminal, but depraved." Outside the courthouse, Eleanor held a press conference that was broadcast live across multiple news networks, using Rebecca's case to announce the introduction of comprehensive legislation designed to strengthen legal protections for pregnant women and improve hospital protocols for domestic violence situations. Rebecca's strength and courage in speaking publicly about what happened to her has already saved other women, Eleanor told the assembled reporters and advocates. We've received reports of 3 other pregnant women who sought help from domestic violence organizations after seeing Rebecca's story. Her willingness to transform her trauma into advocacy is changing lives. The media attention brought an unexpected and deeply troubling development. 3 other women came forward with stories of being assaulted or threatened by Vivian Sterling in situations that demonstrated a pattern of violence that predated her relationship with Harrison. Jennifer Walsh, Vivian's former college roommate, described being pushed down a flight of stairs during an argument about boyfriend troubles. Sarah Kim, a business associate, reported being shoved against a wall during a meeting where she disagreed with Vivian's marketing strategy. Maria Gonzalez, a restaurant server, detailed being slapped across the face for bringing the wrong wine to Vivian's table during a business dinner. Detective Santos reopened investigations into all 3 incidents, discovering that each woman had initially decided not to file charges due to Vivian's family connections and their fear that their complaints would not be taken seriously by law enforcement. What we're seeing is a pattern of violence that spans several years, Detective Santos explained to the media. Ms. Sterling has apparently been using physical intimidation and assault to control situations whenever she doesn't get her way. Mrs. Caldwell's case isn't an isolated incident. It's the culmination of years of escalating violent behavior. Vivian's defense team realized they weren't defending an isolated incident of poor judgment. They were defending a pattern of criminal behavior that demonstrated their client's fundamental disregard for other people's safety and dignity. Harrison, meanwhile, was discovering that the therapeutic process Dr. Chen had recommended was forcing him to confront aspects of his character and behavior that he had spent years avoiding or rationalizing. The individual therapy sessions were difficult enough, but the group therapy program was proving to be even more challenging as he listened to other men describe the psychological patterns that had led them to betray and abuse their families. I used to tell myself that my affair was about attraction or chemistry, Harrison admitted during one group session. But Dr. Chen helped me understand that it was really about power and control. Vivian made me feel important and successful without requiring any emotional vulnerability or growth from me. Dr. Chen nodded, encouraging him to continue exploring this insight. What did Rebecca require from you that felt so threatening? She wanted me to be present, Harrison said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. Not just physically present, but emotionally available. She wanted to know what I was thinking and feeling. She wanted me to share in the excitement about the baby, to be involved in planning our future together. She wanted intimacy, and I was terrified of that level of connection. The group therapy sessions also helped Harrison understand how his emotional unavailability had created vulnerability in his marriage that someone like Vivian was able to exploit. I made Rebecca compete for my attention and affection, he realized during another session. I withheld emotional intimacy as a way of maintaining control, and when she tried harder to connect with me, I punished her by becoming even more distant. I created the exact conditions that made my affair possible. Rebecca, still confined to bed rest, but no longer in immediate medical danger, had used her recovery time to become an informal spokesperson for pregnant women facing domestic violence. Her hospital room had become a meeting place for advocacy groups, legal experts, and other survivors who found strength in her willingness to speak publicly about her experience. I never wanted to be a public figure, Rebecca told a reporter from Women's Health magazine during an interview that would be published in their next issue. But I realized that my story could help other women understand that they're not alone, that there are resources available, and that they deserve better than relationships where they have to compete for basic respect and loyalty. Rebecca's transformation from victim to advocate was remarkable to witness. Thomas observed his niece developing the kind of moral authority that came from surviving trauma and choosing to use that experience to protect others rather than simply heal privately. You're saving other people by sharing what happened to you, Thomas told her during one of their daily conversations. No, Rebecca corrected him. I'm saving myself by making sure what happened to me matters for something larger than just my own recovery. Margaret Caldwell had surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming one of Rebecca's most dedicated supporters and fiercest advocates. The woman who had spent her adult life avoiding family drama and maintaining social appearances had discovered that protecting her daughter-in-law and granddaughter was more important than preserving her son's reputation. I failed Harrison by never requiring him to take responsibility for his behavior, Margaret admitted during one conversation with Eleanor. I made excuses for his selfishness, I covered for his emotional immaturity, and I taught him that wealth and status could substitute for character and integrity. Rebecca and my granddaughter are paying the price for my failure as a mother. But Margaret was determined not to repeat those mistakes. She had quietly used her social connections and financial resources to ensure that Rebecca's legal representation was the best available, that her medical care exceeded even the excellent standard provided by Thomas's hospital, and that her future financial security was guaranteed regardless of what happened to Harrison's business or their marriage. I want my granddaughter to grow up in a world where she never has to choose between her safety and her financial security, Margaret explained. If Harrison earns his way back into your lives, it should be because he's become the kind of man who deserves your love, not because you need his money. The preliminary hearing concluded with Judge Hernandez binding Vivian over for trial on multiple felony charges: assault on a pregnant woman, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and solicitation of evidence tampering. The combined charges carried a potential sentence of up to 7 years in state prison. Outside the courthouse, Vivian made what would prove to be her final public statement, one that sealed her fate in the court of public opinion and probably influenced her eventual sentencing. This whole thing is a witch hunt orchestrated by a bitter, manipulative woman who couldn't keep her husband satisfied, Vivian told the crowd of reporters and advocates. I'm the real victim here. I'm being persecuted because I had the courage to give Harrison the kind of sophisticated relationship he deserved. The statement was played on every news channel in the state. In public opinion, which had already turned decisively against Vivian, became even more hostile. Even her father, Charles Sterling, issued a public statement distancing himself from his daughter's behavior and announcing that she would no longer have access to the family's financial resources for her legal defense. My daughter's actions are indefensible, Charles Sterling said in a prepared statement. While I will always love her, I cannot and will not use my resources to help her escape accountability for assaulting a pregnant woman and then attempting to destroy that woman's credibility through criminal means. As Rebecca watched the news coverage from her hospital bed, surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family, she realized something fundamental had changed in her understanding of power, protection, and justice. She had always assumed that power belonged to people with money, status, and connections, people like Harrison and his family, people like Vivian and her father. But real power, she was learning, came from having people who would stand up for you without asking for anything in return. People who would fight for justice simply because it was right. 6 weeks after the assault that had changed everything, Rebecca was finally cleared for limited activity outside the hospital, though she remained under strict medical supervision and was required to stay within a few minutes of emergency medical care. Her new apartment, purchased and furnished by Margaret as a gesture of protective support, was located just 3 blocks from Metropolitan General Hospital and less than a mile from Thomas and Eleanor's house. The apartment represented more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of Rebecca's independence and her ability to make choices based on what was best for her and her daughter, rather than what was most convenient or expected by others. Margaret had insisted on purchasing the apartment outright and putting it in Rebecca's name, ensuring that she would never again face homelessness or dependence as potential consequences of leaving an unsatisfactory relationship. I want my granddaughter to grow up knowing that women in our family always have options, Margaret explained when Rebecca initially protested the generous gift. If Harrison proves that he's genuinely changed and earns his way back into your lives, you'll choose him because you want to, not because you have to. Harrison had continued his intensive therapy program, attending individual sessions with Dr. Chen twice a week and participating in the group therapy program for men who had committed emotional abuse. The changes in his behavior and perspective were remarkable to observe, but Rebecca remained cautious about interpreting his progress. "How do I know this isn't just a more sophisticated form of manipulation?" she asked Dr. Chen during one of the joint counseling sessions that Harrison had requested, but only Rebecca could authorize. "How do I know he won't revert to his old patterns once the legal consequences and public scrutiny fade away?" "You don't know," Dr. Chen said with the honesty that made her one of the most respected therapists in the state. "That's why we don't make decisions about relationship reconciliation until we've seen sustained change over a significant period of time. But I can tell you that Harrison is doing work that goes far beyond what would be necessary if his only goal was managing the public relations consequences of this situation." Dr. Chen explained that Harrison's therapy was addressing fundamental psychological patterns that had developed over decades, not just the specific behaviors that had led to the crisis in his marriage. "He's examining his relationship with power, control, emotional intimacy, and vulnerability," she said. "He's learning to recognize the difference between love and possession, between providing for his family and using financial control to avoid emotional responsibility. This isn't the kind of superficial behavior modification that someone does just to get out of trouble." Harrison had liquidated several significant business assets to create a trust fund that guaranteed Rebecca's financial independence for life, regardless of what happened to their marriage or his continued business success. The fund was structured to provide for her education, housing, medical care, and their daughter's future expenses, eliminating any financial pressure for Rebecca to make relationship decisions based on economic necessity rather than genuine choice. "I don't want your money," Rebecca had told him when the trust fund was first proposed. "It's not my money," Harrison replied. "It's my daughter's inheritance and your security. I want her to grow up knowing that her father provided for her future, and I want you to know that any decisions you make about our relationship are free from financial coercion." Vivian Sterling's trial began on a cold Tuesday morning in early November, 6 months after the assault that had triggered this legal and personal reckoning. The courthouse was packed with reporters, women's rights advocates, domestic violence survivors, and curious members of the public who had followed the case through months of media coverage. Prosecutor Janet Morrison approached the trial with the methodical preparation that had made her one of the most successful prosecutors in the state. She had built her case around three central themes: the deliberate nature of Vivian's assault on Rebecca, the pattern of violent behavior that predated this specific incident, and Vivian's continued attempts to escape accountability through witness intimidation and evidence manipulation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morrison said during her opening statement, "this case is about a woman who believed that her wealth, her connections, and her sense of entitlement gave her the right to assault a pregnant patient in a hospital room, then attempt to destroy that victim's credibility when she faced consequences for her criminal behavior." Morrison systematically presented the evidence: security footage showing Vivian's escalating aggression, culminating in the deliberate kick that sent Rebecca falling to the floor, medical records documenting the injuries and trauma, witness testimony from hospital staff who had observed the attack, and recorded evidence of Vivian's attempt to bribe Maria Santos to plant drugs in Rebecca's room. "The defendant wants you to believe that this was an emotional outburst, a moment of poor judgment triggered by circumstances beyond her control," Morrison continued. "But the evidence shows calculated violence followed by calculated attempts to frame the victim for crimes she didn't commit. This wasn't passion, it was predation." Marcus Webb, Vivian's defense attorney, tried to argue that his client was the real victim, manipulated by a complex family situation and overwhelmed by emotional circumstances that had driven her to behavior that was out of character for someone of her background and social standing. "My client is a successful businesswoman with no prior criminal record," Webb argued during his opening statement. "She became involved in a situation that spiraled out of control, and her actions, while regrettable, were the result of emotional distress rather than criminal intent." But Webb's defense strategy collapsed when the prosecution presented testimony from Jennifer Walsh, Sarah Kim, and Maria Gonzalez, the three women who had come forward with accounts of previous violent incidents involving Vivian. Their testimony established a pattern of behavior that demonstrated Vivian's willingness to use physical violence whenever she encountered resistance or disagreement. When Rebecca testified, her quiet dignity and clear recounting of the events destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for Vivian. She spoke without dramatics or embellishment, simply telling the truth about what had happened that night and how the assault had affected both her physical health and her emotional well-being. "I wasn't trying to steal anyone's husband," Rebecca said when Webb attempted to suggest that she had somehow provoked the attack. "I was 7 months pregnant, trying to share good news with my husband about our daughter. I never threatened Ms. Sterling. I never even spoke directly to her until she began verbally attacking me in the hospital room." Rebecca's testimony was particularly powerful when she described the moment of the assault itself and her immediate fear for her unborn daughter's safety. "When she kicked me and I fell, my first thought wasn't about the physical pain," Rebecca said. "My first thought was that my daughter might die because someone was so consumed with jealousy and hatred that she was willing to hurt a pregnant woman to make a point about her relationship with my husband." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Judge Patricia Hernandez had presided over hundreds of domestic violence cases during her 15 years on the bench, but few had demonstrated the kind of calculated cruelty that Vivian's case represented. During the sentencing hearing, she made it clear that Vivian's wealth and social connections would not protect her from facing the full consequences of her criminal behavior. "Mrs. Sterling," Judge Hernandez said during sentencing, "you attacked a pregnant woman in a hospital because you couldn't accept that your affair had consequences. You endangered both a mother and her unborn child because of your own selfish desires and sense of entitlement. Then when you faced accountability for your criminal behavior, you attempted to frame your victim for drug possession." Judge Hernandez sentenced Vivian to 2 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation and mandatory anger management counseling. She also ordered Vivian to pay full restitution for Rebecca's medical expenses, legal costs, and emotional distress damages. "This court finds your behavior reprehensible and your complete lack of remorse deeply concerning," Judge Hernandez continued. "You have shown no understanding of the harm you caused, no empathy for your victim, and no acceptance of responsibility for your choices. This sentence reflects not just the severity of your crimes, but your continued refusal to acknowledge that you committed them." Auntie. Outside the courthouse, Eleanor held another press conference to announce that the Rebecca Act had gained enough legislative support to be introduced in the next session, with backing from women's advocacy groups, medical associations, and law enforcement organizations throughout the state. Rebecca's courage in speaking publicly about her experience has already resulted in systemic changes that will protect other pregnant women, Eleanor announced to the assembled reporters and advocates. "The legislation bearing her name will create enhanced penalties for assault on pregnant women and establish protocols for hospitals to better identify and respond to domestic violence situations." That evening, Rebecca went into labor 3 weeks earlier than expected, but Dr. Martinez assured her that this was likely due to natural progression rather than stress-related complications. Unlike the terrifying emergency that had brought her to the hospital 6 months earlier, this labor proceeded normally, surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family. Thomas had the honor of delivering his own great niece, with Eleanor and Grace assisting and Margaret holding Rebecca's hand through the contractions. When Sarah Elizabeth Matthews Caldwell took her first breath at 6:47 p.m., weighing 6 pounds and 2 ounces, the room filled with tears of joy and relief from people who had spent months worrying about this moment. Harrison was present, but respectfully positioned where he could witness his daughter's birth without interfering with Rebecca's experience. When Sarah was placed in Rebecca's arms for the first time, the new mother looked at her daughter and made a silent promise that this child would grow up knowing she was wanted, protected, and loved unconditionally. "Can I see her?" Harrison asked quietly, and Rebecca nodded, allowing him to approach the bed where his daughter was taking her first look at the world. When Sarah grasped her father's finger with her tiny hand, Harrison broke down completely, overwhelmed by love for this child and recognition of how close he had come to losing both her and Rebecca through his own selfishness and emotional cowardice. "I almost lost you both," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I almost destroyed the most important thing in my life because I was too afraid to be the husband and father you deserved." "But you didn't lose us," Rebecca said quietly, her voice carrying a strength and certainty that surprised even her. "We're all here. We're all safe. And that's what matters now." Sarah Elizabeth Matthews Caldwell had been born into a family that would teach her about resilience, justice, and the difference between love and possession. Her first breaths were taken in a room filled with people who had chosen to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it was complicated, even when it required them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their relationships. 3 months after Sarah's birth, Rebecca returned to work at Metropolitan General Hospital in a position that had been created specifically for her, patient advocate coordinator, specializing in domestic violence cases involving pregnant women. Her office was located just 2 floors below the emergency department where her own crisis had unfolded, allowing her to be available immediately whenever a situation similar to her own required someone who understood both the medical and emotional complexities of violence against expectant mothers. Sarah spent her days in the hospital's employee daycare center, surrounded by medical staff who had watched her grow from a pregnancy threatened by violence into a healthy, thriving infant with her mother's gentle temperament and her father's determined spirit. Grace stopped by during her breaks to hold the baby and marvel at how much Sarah had grown. Thomas brought toys from the hospital gift shop and delighted in teaching his great niece to recognize his voice. Eleanor knitted blankets and booties in every color imaginable, creating a wardrobe that could outfit triplets. Rebecca's first case as patient advocate was heartbreakingly similar to her own experience. Maria Johnson was a 24-year-old woman, 6 months pregnant, who had arrived in the emergency department with injuries that didn't match her story of falling downstairs. Her boyfriend paced the waiting area, making increasingly aggressive demands about her medical treatment and refusing to allow medical staff to speak with her privately. "Mrs. Johnson," Rebecca said gently, approaching the young woman with the calm authority that came from having survived a similar experience. "I'm Rebecca Caldwell, the patient advocate here at Metropolitan General. I want you to know that you're safe here, and whatever brought you to the hospital tonight, we're going to make sure you get all the help and support you need." For the first time that evening, Mrs. Johnson made direct eye contact with someone, recognizing something in Rebecca's voice that told her this was someone who would understand her situation without judgment or pressure. "I've been where you are," Rebecca continued quietly. "I was 7 months pregnant when someone attacked me right here in this hospital. I thought my world was ending, but I was wrong. It was just beginning." Mrs. Johnson started crying, not the desperate tears of someone who felt trapped, but the relieved tears of someone who had finally found another person who understood her situation and could help her see that she had options beyond just surviving day to day. Thomas appeared beside Rebecca, recognizing the same protective instincts in his niece that had driven his own medical career toward advocacy for vulnerable patients. "What do we have?" he asked quietly. "Probable domestic violence situation," Rebecca replied, falling naturally into the clinical language that allowed medical professionals to discuss difficult cases without compromising patient confidentiality. "Injury pattern inconsistent with reported cause. Partner is exhibiting controlling behavior and won't allow private conversation with patient." Thomas nodded, immediately understanding the protocol that had been developed partially in response to Rebecca's own experience. "Same approach we used for your situation. Document everything. Separate them for individual interviews. Ensure she understands all available options and resources." Rebecca spent the next 4 hours with Mrs. Johnson, helping her navigate the medical examination, connecting her with legal resources, and ensuring that she understood that she didn't have to return to a dangerous relationship if she chose not to. By morning, Mrs. Johnson had decided to move into a residential facility for pregnant women leaving abusive relationships, taking the first step toward building a life where she and her baby would be safe. "How did you know?" Mrs. Johnson asked Rebecca as she was being discharged to the care of advocates from the domestic violence shelter. "How did you know that I could do this?" "Because someone believed I could do it when I didn't believe in myself," Rebecca answered. "And because every woman deserves to raise her children in safety, even when that means making scary changes to create that safety." Harrison continued his therapy and his gradual rehabilitation as both a person and a potential co-parent. His progress was steady but slow, marked by genuine insights into his behavior and authentic changes in how he approached relationships and responsibility. Whether he and Rebecca would eventually reconcile remained an open question, but their co-parenting relationship had become respectful and supportive. "I want to ask you something," Harrison said during one of their weekly meetings to discuss Sarah's schedule and needs. "Not about us, but about her." "What about her?" Rebecca asked, adjusting Sarah's blanket as their 3-month-old daughter slept peacefully in her carrier. "I want her to grow up knowing the real story of what happened when she was born," Harrison said carefully. "Not a sanitized version that protects my reputation, but the truth about what I did wrong and how you found the strength to protect both of you." Rebecca was surprised by this request. "Why would you want her to know about the worst parts of our story?" "Because someday she's going to face situations where people try to convince her that abuse is love, that jealousy is passion, that she should accept less than she deserves from relationships," Harrison explained. "I want her to have your example to guide her when those moments come." Rebecca considered this carefully. "And your example too," she said finally. "The example of someone who did wrong, but took responsibility and worked to become better. Both parts of the story matter." Margaret had become one of Rebecca's closest friends and allies, transforming from a distant mother-in-law focused on appearances into a devoted grandmother who prioritized substance over style. "You know," Margaret said during one of their regular Sunday dinners, "I used to think the worst thing that could happen to our family was scandal. Now I realize the worst thing was silence, pretending problems didn't exist instead of facing them honestly." Eleanor, ever the advocate, continued to use Rebecca's story in her speeches about domestic violence prevention and her work to pass the Rebecca Act. Rebecca's strength didn't come from surviving the attack. She would tell audiences of medical professionals, law enforcement officers, and social workers. It came from building a life where such attacks couldn't happen again. "No," Rebecca corrected her during one speech where she appeared as a guest speaker. "My strength came from realizing that I wasn't alone, that there were people who would fight for justice even when it was complicated, even when it required them to take sides in family conflicts." Thomas watched his niece work with other vulnerable patients and saw her transform her trauma into a calling that would save other lives. "You're making a difference for other people by sharing what happened to you," he observed. "I'm making a difference for myself," Rebecca corrected him, "by making sure that what happened to me serves a purpose larger than just my own healing." Vivian served 18 months of her 2-year sentence before being released on parole, having shown no genuine remorse or personal growth during her incarceration. She immediately began posting on social media about being the real victim of a conspiracy by powerful people who had destroyed her life to protect their own reputations. But her influence was gone. Her father had disowned her publicly and permanently. Her former colleagues avoided any association with her. The media treated her as a cautionary tale rather than a credible voice. Most importantly, her attempts to re-enter Harrison and Rebecca's lives were blocked by restraining orders that remained in effect and by a legal system that had demonstrated its willingness to hold her accountable for her behavior. When Vivian attempted to contact Harrison through his office, his assistant immediately forwarded the message to Rebecca's attorney, who documented it as a violation of the restraining order and a breach of her parole conditions. Vivian quickly learned that her continued attempts to harass or intimidate Rebecca would result in her return to prison to serve the remainder of her original sentence. Rebecca felt nothing when she heard about Vivian's attempts to re-enter their lives. Not anger, not fear, not even satisfaction at Vivian's continued legal troubles. Vivian Sterling had become irrelevant to the life Rebecca had built, a cautionary tale rather than an ongoing threat. "I used to think forgiveness meant letting people back into your life," Rebecca told her support group, which she still attended monthly. "Now I understand that forgiveness means not letting their actions define your future. Vivian can't hurt me anymore because I'm no longer the person she attacked." On Sarah's first birthday, Rebecca organized a celebration in the hospital break room where her daughter had essentially been saved by the protective network that had assembled around them. Thomas and Eleanor, Grace and her family, Margaret, Harrison, and dozens of medical staff members who had become extended family gathered to celebrate not just Sarah's first year of life, but the transformation of trauma into purpose that had defined Rebecca's journey. As Rebecca watched her daughter take her first tentative steps between Thomas's outstretched arms and Grace's encouraging words, she realized that something profound had happened over the past 18 months. She had discovered that being loved wasn't about being chosen over someone else. It was about choosing people who would never make you compete for their loyalty in the first place. Sarah Elizabeth Matthews Caldwell was growing up surrounded by people who had demonstrated their commitment to protecting her and her mother through actions rather than words, through consistent support rather than dramatic gestures, through genuine love rather than possessive control. Harrison approached Rebecca as the birthday party wound down, carrying the question that had been building for months of demonstrated change and consistent behavioral improvement. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'll accept whatever answer you give me." She turned to face him, Sarah balanced comfortably on her hip, surrounded by the people who had become her chosen family. "I'm not asking you to take me back," Harrison continued carefully. "I'm not asking you to trust me yet because I know that trust has to be earned over time through consistent actions. But I'm asking if you think there might be a future where we could try to build something new together. Not because either of us is desperate or dependent, but because we both become people capable of the kind of love that Sarah deserves to see." Rebecca looked at this man who had been her husband, then her betrayer, then her co-parent, and now something new. Someone who had earned the right to ask for a second chance through genuine change and consistent behavior over more than a year of therapeutic work and demonstrated commitment to becoming better. She thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the blood on the marble floor of his office building to this birthday party in a hospital break room, surrounded by people who had chosen to stand up for justice and protection rather than wealth and status. "Ask me again in 6 months," Rebecca said finally. "If you're still doing the therapeutic work, if you're still the man you've become over this past year, if you're still committed to being the kind of father Sarah deserves and the kind of partner who deserves a second chance, ask me then." Harrison smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Rebecca had seen from him since before their marriage began to deteriorate. "I'll ask you in 6 months," he said, "and I'll keep doing the work whether you say yes or no, because Sarah deserves a father who's committed to being the best person he can be." As Rebecca drove home to her apartment with Sarah sleeping peacefully in the car seat behind her, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The assault that had threatened to destroy her life had instead created space for her to build something stronger, more authentic, and more sustainable than what she had lost. She had learned that protection could become power, that family could be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you creates the foundation for the best thing that can grow from it. Sarah stirred in her sleep and made the soft, cooing sound that meant she was dreaming, probably about the faces and voices that surrounded her with unconditional love and protection. Rebecca smiled, knowing that her daughter would grow up in a world where love was freely given rather than desperately sought, where strength was measured by what you could build rather than what you could control, where family meant people who showed up during crises rather than people who created them. The emergency department lights of Metropolitan General faded in her rearview mirror, but Rebecca knew she would be back tomorrow. There would be other vulnerable women, other moments of crisis, other opportunities to transform pain into protection and trauma into purpose. She had found her calling in the place where she had nearly lost everything, and that transformation from victim to advocate represented the most beautiful kind of justice, the kind that prevented other people from suffering what she had endured. The blood on the marble floor had been washed away long ago, but the strength it had revealed would last forever. Rebecca had learned that survival wasn't just about getting through trauma. It was about building a life where such trauma couldn't happen again, not just to her, but to other women who deserve protection, advocacy, and the knowledge that they weren't alone. As she carried her sleeping daughter up the stairs to their apartment, Rebecca realized that her story had come full circle in the most unexpected way. She had started as a victim in a hospital emergency room and had become an advocate in that same hospital, using her experience to protect other women from the kind of violence she had survived. Sarah would grow up knowing that her mother had transformed the worst moment of their lives into a career dedicated to ensuring other families didn't face similar dangers alone. She would learn that strength wasn't about avoiding difficult situations, but about facing them with the support of people who chose to stand up for justice, even when it was complicated. The apartment that Margaret had given them represented more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of independence, of choices made from strength rather than fear, of a future built on genuine security rather than anxious dependence. Rebecca tucked Sarah into her crib and stood watching her daughter sleep, marveling at the perfect features and peaceful expression of a child who had survived trauma before birth and was now thriving in an environment of unconditional love and protection. The journey from that terrifying night in Harrison's office lobby to this moment of quiet contentment in their own home had taught Rebecca lessons about power, justice, family, and love that she could never have learned any other way. She had discovered that real strength came not from avoiding vulnerability, but from building a life where vulnerability was protected by people who genuinely cared about her well-being. She had learned that justice wasn't always immediate or obvious, but that it was worth fighting for because it protected other people from similar harm. Most importantly, she had learned that love, real love, wasn't about competing for attention or acceptance, but about choosing people who made competition unnecessary because their commitment was freely given and consistently demonstrated. Sarah Elizabeth Matthews Caldwell would grow up knowing all of these truths, not because her mother preached them, but because she had lived them and built a life that demonstrated their reality every single day. The blood on the marble floor had marked the end of one story and the beginning of another. Rebecca's marriage to Harrison might or might not be rebuilt, but her commitment to protecting other vulnerable women was permanent, as was her determination to raise her daughter in an environment where love was abundant, protection was reliable, and strength was measured by service to others rather than dominance over them. As Rebecca finally settled into sleep in her own bed, in her own apartment, surrounded by the security that came from genuine independence in authentic relationships, she realized that she had achieved something she had never thought possible during those terrifying hours when her marriage was ending and her pregnancy was threatened. She had found peace, not the fragile peace of someone avoiding conflict, but the deep peace of someone who had faced the worst and discovered that she was strong enough not just to survive, but to transform survival into purpose, trauma into advocacy, and personal pain into protection for others. The emergency department of Metropolitan General Hospital would open its doors tomorrow to new patients, new crises, and new opportunities for Rebecca to use her experience to help other women navigate the intersection of medical vulnerability and domestic violence. And Rebecca would be there, not as a victim seeking help, but as an advocate offering it, completing the transformation from someone who needed protection to someone who provided it. That transformation, from vulnerability to strength, from isolation to community, from victim to advocate, represented the most profound kind of healing possible. Healing that didn't just restore what was lost, but created something better than what had existed before. The blood on the marble floor had been the beginning of Rebecca's real life, the life where she chose her own family, built her own security, and used her own experience to protect other women from similar trauma. Sarah would grow up in that life, surrounded by people who had proven their love through actions rather than words, protected by a mother who had learned the difference between love and possession, supported by a community that had chosen justice over convenience. And that, Rebecca thought as she drifted off to sleep, was the most beautiful possible ending to a story that had begun with blood and betrayal, but had become something precious. A life built on authentic relationships, meaningful work, and the knowledge that trauma could be transformed into purpose if you had the courage to do the work and the wisdom to accept help from people who genuinely cared about your well-being. The circle was complete, but it wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning, the first chapter of Sarah's story, and the next chapter of Rebecca's advocacy work and her continued journey toward whatever future she would choose to build with the freedom and security that genuine love and authentic community had made possible.